In the last episode, Midlothian, Texas Police Chief Roy Vaughn and Lieutenant Billy Fowler were searching for missing undercover police officer George Raffield, who was rumored to have been murdered by two teenage boys. Greg Knighten, the son of a Dallas police officer and the town's resident drug dealer, and Richard Goeglein, a Satan-worshipping delinquent who had moved to Texas after his family was forced to flee Arizona after a disturbing act of violence. This, with a rash of attempted suicides amongst his acolytes, Richard Goeglein, by all accounts, was the manifestation of evil. In recent years, news media has begun to reevaluate and deconstruct the Satanic Panic, a bout of mass hysteria that afflicted the United States for over a decade. But what if it wasn't just hysteria? What if some of it was true? Ritual Rewind brings you into the darkest corners of the 1980s, uncovering the crimes, conspiracies, and occult fears that shaped a generation. Tonight, we rewind it back to 1987 and dive into the story of Richard Goeglein and Greg Knighten and their murder of undercover cop George Raffield in Midlothian, Texas. It's the case of the Devil in 21 Jump Street. I'm your host, Drew, and you're listening to The Ritual Rewind. There was something about Goeglein that attracted the school's outcasts into his orbit, and he had a mesmerizing hold on them. They began to dress like Goeglein, listen to heavy music like Goeglein, and more concerning, studying books on Satanism and witchcraft like Goeglein. And they often acted out at his direction, as if they were only in service to him. This, of course, caused great concern amongst the faculty at the school. One such student named Chuck began to mimic Goeglein's behavior. He cut himself with razor blades and burned circles into his skin with cigarette lighters, just like Goeglein. Goeglein had told Chuck that these markings made them blood brothers. But the friendship was ended by Chuck's parents when Chuck's mother returned home early one day and found a suicide note left by her son. They believed, rightfully so, that Goeglein had encouraged their son to kill himself. Luckily, they found Chuck before he could go through with the act. Goeglein was disappointed that Chuck's attempt had been thwarted. But what was more eerie and unsettling to the school's administration, Chuck's suicide attempt wasn't an isolated event. There had actually been a rash of attempted suicides amongst the students, and each one of them had a connection to Goeglein. The principal approached Goeglein's mother and stated her concerns, but her concerns were promptly ignored. So the principal tried another tactic. Goeglein was failing school, and if he didn't have a passing grade in 4 subjects by the midterm, she would have him expelled. Goeglein's mother was incensed, not at her son, but at the principal. And instead of pushing her son to study and excel, she withdrew him from the school to keep the expulsion off his record. While living in Arizona, Goeglein befriended another delinquent named Frank Ross. The boys bonded over heavy metal music, Satan worship, and alcohol. They would spend many nights in Goeglein's trailer getting drunk and listening to records. One of Goeglein's girlfriends, one that had died, had given him a black, heart-shaped amulet, and when used in conjunction with a Ouija board, Goeglein believed he could communicate with the deceased girl and that she could predict the future for up to 3 days in advance. One night, Frank and Goeglein visited an abandoned house that was known as the White House. It had become a gathering place for devil worshippers. There, Frank drew a pentagram on the floor, lit a candle, and slit the throat of a stray cat. As they chanted from a spell book, Frank leaned over to Goeglein and whispered in his ear,
"I think the devil wants you dead."
Goeglein recoiled and drew his switchblade, but Frank wasn't alarmed. He actually laughed about it. Frank lifted the shirt to show the inverted cross he had burned on his stomach, and he told Goeglein that they were now blood brothers and disciples of the devil, and because of that, he wouldn't harm him. But Frank did say that they needed to find someone else to sacrifice to the devil. And they found it with 16-year-old Elliot Smith. Elliot Smith was a shy, awkward youth who struggled to make friends. He was a religious child and toted his Bible around with him wherever he went. But that didn't last long, not after Frank and Goeglein befriended him. One night, not long after their adventure in the White House, Frank and Goeglein took Smith for a drive around town and got him wasted off a bottle of Jack. They then returned to Goeglein's trailer to listen to music and to worship Satan. And at some point in the night, an altercation broke out between Goeglein and Smith. Smith had stumbled drunkenly into the shelves and knocked over Goeglein's books and records. Goeglein attacked Smith, and in a desperate attempt to protect himself, Smith grabbed a sword that was displayed on the wall. Goeglein kicked Smith out of his trailer, and Smith landed hard on the ground outside. The sword fell out of his hands and landed safely away. That should have been the end of the fight, but the boys were drunk, and Frank had been threatening Smith all night. Frank came out of the trailer with a baseball bat and attacked Smith, bashing his skull in. Smith went limp immediately, but Frank continued his attack, beating Smith with the bat over and over again. Smith was out. He couldn't even hold up his hands to protect himself. Goeglein had to wrestle the bat away from Frank to end it. And then as they looked down at Smith, his head cracked open, his brain exposed. Frank began to panic. He wanted to bury the body and hide the evidence. If the police came, he was sure he'd get fried in the electric chair. But before the two boys could do anything, Goeglein's father came out of the house. He had been awoken by the commotion outside. Goeglein's father was disturbed by what he saw, and he rushed Smith to the hospital. But he didn't stay with Smith, and he didn't call the police. Instead, he returned home and ransacked his son's room. He confiscated all the satanic material and burned it in a trash bin outside. Elliot Smith was in a coma for 9 days, and Frank was arrested and charged with the attempted murder. Goeglein and his family moved to Midlothian a few weeks later, and there, Goeglein would find another friend to influence, Greg Knighten. Once the police had confirmation of Knighten's involvement, it didn't take long to round up the other suspects, Goeglein and a third kid named Jonathan Joby, who was also 16. When Goeglein was approached by police, he whipped out his switchblade and threatened them, saying,
"I can't deal with but one fucking pig at a time."
Before the incident could escalate any further, Goeglein's father stepped in and disarmed his son. He turned the knife over to the officers on the scene. When taken to the police station, Goeglein was resistant to questioning and refused to snitch on his friends. Knighten claimed ignorance of the murder. He admitted that he was with Raffield that night, but that Raffield had dropped him off at his girlfriend's house, and he hadn't seen him after that. Knighten said his girlfriend's dad took him home around midnight. The third boy, Joby, was a little more talkative. He told Fowler that it wasn't right for Goeglein to take all the heat, that Knighten was the one that pulled the trigger. Though how Joby knew this was questionable, because Joby claimed to not have been there during the murder. Joby claimed to have just picked them up after the incident. Fowler demanded that Joby take him to the location where he had picked up Goeglein and Knighten. He hoped to recover Rayfield's body before it decomposed too harshly in the Texas sun. As they got near the scene of the crime, Joby broke down in the back of the police cruiser and begged Fowler to take him back to the jail cell. But Fowler refused, and they pressed on. Back at the police station, Vaughn told Goeglein that Joby had confessed and that they were already on their way to retrieve Rayfield's body. It was then that Goeglein broke down and confessed, but he pinned the actual killing on Knighten. He then described the day's events leading up to the murder of George Raffield. The day before the murder, Cynthia was visited by 2 police officers who wanted to check her apartment. They had received information that she was in possession of a stolen stereo. She handed the stereo over to the police, but denied ever knowing that it was stolen, saying that she paid a fair price for it. But inside, she seethed. It took everything to keep her anger in check. She knew now that Rayfield was a narc, and after the officers left, Cynthia immediately phoned Knighten and reamed him out. She blamed him for what happened and claimed that he had gotten them all in a shitload of trouble. Everyone who interacted with him and Rayfield were going to be arrested and were going to go to jail. And she threatened to kick Knighten's ass for this the next time she saw him. Knighten was angry and he felt betrayed by Rayfield. He assured Cynthia that he would take care of the situation. He then enlisted the help of Goeglein and Joby to devise a plan to, as he said, ice the narc. Goeglein decided to consult the black heart-shaped amulet around his neck. He wanted the spirit's advice. Goeglein placed the amulet on the Ouija board and began to ask the spirit questions.
Is George Raffield a cop?
Goeglein, Knighten, and Joby watched with rapt attention as the amulet began to move around the board, ping-ponging off the letters until it spelled out
C-O-P, cop.
Goeglein asked another question.
Should Knighten kill him?
The amulet began to move again, spelling out
trouble.
And for Goeglein, that was settled. He would help. They would kill Rayfield. The 3 boys began to spitball ideas on how they would do it. Joby had heard that mercury was an instant killer and suggested that they poison Rayfield's school lunch with mercury from a thermometer. Goeglein thought they should bomb Rayfield's truck. Knighten had a better idea. Knighten would steal his dad's police-issued gun, and they would lure Rayfield into a field, and then they would shoot him. Knighten told Joby that he would hang back, wait 30 minutes, then come and pick them up. The boys agreed, and this was the plan. On the night of the murder, Rayfield picked up Knighten and Goeglein around 8:30 p.m. The three of them rode in silence, none of them talking, just listening to Slayer blasted over the speakers as they made their way to the destination. Rayfield followed Knighten's instructions and pulled his truck into an empty field and parked. They were going to wait for a buyer, or at least that's what Knighten told Rayfield. Knighten and Rayfield climbed into the bed of the truck and lit up a joint. Goeglein excused himself to take a piss in the bushes, but he didn't have to go. He just didn't want to be there. And from the seclusion of the trees, Goeglein watched as Rayfield and Knighten talked in the back of the truck. He listened as Knighten asked Rayfield to change the radio station to something different. Rayfield slipped off the back of the truck and walked towards the cab. And that's when they rang out. 3 gunshots in quick succession. One was all that was needed. It blew the back of Rayfield's head off with the first shot. The second nicked his scalp as he flopped to the ground, and the third missed him entirely. And with that, everything went silent. Goeglein reappeared out of the darkness, and the two boys went to work cleaning up the scene. They stole Rayfield's wallet from his jacket and wiped the truck of their fingerprints. They then hiked it to the main road and waited for Joby to pick them up. Once inside Joby's truck, Knighten took out the cash from Rayfield's wallet. It was $18, and they split it amongst themselves. Knighten then ordered Joby to drive him to Cynthia's house. He was eager to tell her what he had done, to end their feud. He wanted her approval and her admiration. But when he arrived, she was less than happy to see him. She had been gone all day, getting high on crank, and was upset that these boys were about to blow up her day off. She took the wallet from Knighten and disposed of it in the garbage.
She then yelled at them to shut the fuck up and get the hell out of her apartment. I don't want to know any more about it.
The boys left, but they couldn't stay silent. They had to tell someone. Goeglein told his girlfriend, who then told her friends. And so the news spread amongst the school. While awaiting trial, both Knighten and Goeglein were imprisoned in the Ellis County Jail. The warden attempted to keep the two boys separated from each other for their own safety. But when they would pass each other in the corridors, Goeglein would threaten to kill Knighten. Knighten, in turn, would then attempt to persuade other inmates to beat the shit out of Goeglein. However, it was all talk because no violence came between the boys while they were in custody. Goeglein received a daily dose of medication to stem his growing anxiety. But instead of taking the pills, he stashed them underneath his mattress. And after accumulating a dozen or so pills, he took them all at once. He was later found lying unconscious on the floor of his jail cell. Officials took him to the hospital, and he had his stomach pumped. Goeglein denied that he attempted suicide. He merely meant it as a momentary escape. Joby was released from jail on a $50,000 bail posted by his grandfather, and he was back in school by Thanksgiving. Faculty and staff were upset at the abrupt return of an accused murderer and voiced their concerns to the principal. But since Joby had yet to be convicted of any crime, the principal was powerless to stop it. The student body broke off into two warring factions, one that blamed Goeglein for the murders and the other that blamed Knighten. These resulted in frequent arguments that bled out from the school's hallways and into the school's parking lot and were ultimately settled with fistfights. In the end, it didn't matter. Both Goeglein and Knighten ended up in prison for the murder of George Raffield. Goeglein accepted a 55-year prison sentence, and Knighten went to trial. At the end of the 7-day trial, the jury's deliberations didn't take long. They came back with a guilty verdict in less than 6 hours and sentenced Knighten to 45 years in prison. As part of his plea bargain, Goeglein's sentence was reduced to match Knighten's. Joby agreed to testify against Knighten for a reduced sentence of 10 years. Cynthia's involvement in the murder was up for debate amongst those in the police department. Vaughn believed that she had solicited the murder. Others believed that she was involved only after the fact. They hoped that the intense pressure would cause her to break and reveal more crucial information about that night. But Cynthia held steadfast in her unwillingness to insist in the investigation. She ultimately agreed to a plea deal for 8 years. Cynthia and Joby were paroled after less than 2 years served. Cynthia died in 2005. Knighten was also paroled in 2020, while Goeglein continues to serve his sentence.
What I did was something a stupid teenager would do, being somewhere where I shouldn't have been. I was not an active predator. I wasn't out to do harm. I'm not that dumb kid anymore. I didn't think it was real. I really didn't. And I don't mean nobody no harm.
Each year, the George Raffield Memorial Scholarship is awarded to a Midlothian High School senior. The application requires a short essay explaining how Raffield's work has influenced student applicants to remain drug-free. During his first round in high school, a teacher of Raffield's presented a project to the class in which students were to write their own epitaphs. This was George Raffield's. As a soul once was within me, I had plans for being a policeman. I figured that's what I wanted to be when I was about 15 years old. I traveled on through my high school years and got into college at Southern Methodist University. I stayed there and graduated, and when I was on duty one day, I was shot in the back, killed instantly. I hope that people will take into consideration the things that could happen in one's lifetime and profession. In researching this episode, we relied on the newspaper reports from the New York Times and the Dallas Morning News, and the book Innocence Lost by Carlton Stowers. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Ritual Rewind. I'm looking to grow this podcast. If you like it, please rate it and review it and share it with your friends. If you're listening to this on YouTube, give it a like and a comment. And as always, you can interact with us at The Ritual Rewind on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Thank you, and good night.